What if the most dangerous thing in The Lord of the Rings is not the ring, not Sauron, not even death, but choice? What if the real story of Book 2 isn't about journeys through darkness, but about the slow collapse of certainty, leadership, and unity under pressure? Because in Book 2, Tolkien does something ruthless. He removes safety. Gandalf is gone. Lorien cannot be carried forward. The Fellowship begins to fracture not because they are weak, but because they are human. Every chapter in Book 2 is a test of temptation, of foresight, of loyalty, of restraint, and by the time the Fellowship breaks, the question is no longer who will win, but what will survival cost? In this video, we are not summarizing Book 2, we are dissecting it. We're tracing how Tolkien uses silence as a weapon, how rivers become instruments of fate, how wisdom without power becomes the final form of strength, and how the greatest tragedy of the Fellowship is not that it breaks, but that it had to. This is a deep, philosophical, no shortcuts analysis of every major strategy Tolkien uses in Book 2: narrative pressure, moral narrowing, psychological isolation, and the slow transformation of heroes into carriers of irreversible choices. If you've ever wondered why Book 2 feels heavier, darker, and more unsettling than you remembered, this video will explain why. But fair warning, once you see what Tolkien is really doing here, you won't be able to unsee it. Stay with me until the end, because Book 2 doesn't just change the story, it changes the reader. Book 2, Chapter 1, Many Meetings, is the chapter where the world finally steps out of rumor and into reality, where whispers become voices, legends take shape, and Frodo awakens not just from sleep but into awareness. Because Rivendell is not merely a place of healing, it is a threshold between the small, frightened life Frodo once knew and the vast, ancient responsibility now waiting for him. And Tolkien opens this chapter quietly, deliberately, with Frodo waking in white sheets under open air. Hearing voices he half recognizes, half remembers from stories, because recovery here is not simply physical but existential, as Frodo learns that survival does not mean escape, only postponement, and the first voice he hears is Gandalf's laughter, warm and reassuring, yet heavy with unspoken gravity, because Gandalf's presence confirms what Frodo already senses in his bones: that the danger has followed him here, and that Rivendell, for all its beauty and safety, is not an end but a gathering point. And Tolkien uses this moment to reorient the story from flight to confrontation, from secrecy to counsel, from personal fear to collective consequence. And as Frodo learns how close he came to becoming a wraith himself, the wound in his shoulder becoming a permanent reminder of how thin the boundary is between resistance and surrender. The ring's influence is subtly reframed, no longer just an external object of pursuit, but an internal weight that will never fully leave him, because Tolkien makes it clear that some scars do not heal, they only grow quieter, and Rivendell itself embodies this truth, timeless and serene on the surface, yet filled with memory, loss, and the ache of long wars. And as Frodo meets Bilbo again, the reunion is tender but tinged with unease. Because Bilbo is no longer simply the adventurous uncle of old, but a living warning of what prolonged contact with the ring does to the soul, thinning it, stretching it, preserving the body while wearing away the will. And Tolkien uses Bilbo's aging here not just to show time passing, but to underline the unnatural suspension the ring imposes, stealing growth in exchange for longevity. And when Bilbo offers Frodo a song about Eärendil, the moment becomes quietly profound. Because the song is about a mariner who sails beyond the world, touching the divine, and returning transformed, mirroring Frodo's own journey toward a destiny he does not yet understand. And Rivendell fills with people from every corner of Middle-earth, dwarves bearing grief and anger, elves carrying ancient sorrow, men weighed down by broken kingdoms and fading honor, and Tolkien carefully orchestrates these many meetings to show that the world's fractures are old, deep, and interconnected. That no evil rises in isolation, and that Sauron's shadow stretches far beyond Mordor into politics, memory, pride, and fear. And when Frodo learns of the council that will soon convene, the tension shifts from survival to decision, because councils are dangerous places in Tolkien's world, not because of violence, but because words shape fate. And as the Council of Elrond begins, Tolkien masterfully slows the pace, allowing history to spill out in layers, not as exposition. Does accumulated regret, revealing how the ring has haunted generations, how Isildur's failure was not simple weakness, but a tragic misunderstanding of power, how Boromir's dream reflects Gondor's desperation, and how even the wise have been uncertain, divided, and delayed. And this chapter becomes one of Tolkien's most philosophical, because it confronts the illusion that evil can be contained, hidden, or used safely, dismantling every argument for compromise, secrecy, or delay. And when Boromir argues that the ring should be wielded against the enemy, Tolkien gives him strength, logic, and passion, because temptation is always most dangerous when it sounds reasonable, and the silence that follows his words is heavy, because everyone present knows the cost of such thinking, and yet fears the alternative even more. And Frodo's role in this chapter is crucial because he is not commanding, not persuasive, not powerful, but present, listening. Absorbing the weight of centuries pressing down on his small frame, and when he finally speaks, offering to take the ring to Mordor, the moment is not heroic in the traditional sense. It is hesitant, almost accidental, as if responsibility has simply reached out and claimed him. And Tolkien's genius lies in making this offer feel inevitable rather than dramatic, because Frodo does not rise to greatness, greatness descends upon him. And this chapter ends not with clarity, but with resolve forged in uncertainty, because the fellowship is not yet named, the road not yet chosen, but the direction of the story has irrevocably shifted, and many meetings becomes the hinge upon which the entire narrative turns, transforming fear into purpose, isolation into shared burden, and rumor into destiny, reminding us that the most important moments in history are often not loud, not violent, and not celebrated, but quiet gatherings where ordinary individuals agree, reluctantly and imperfectly, to do what must be done simply because no one else will. And if this kind of deep, slow-burn analysis, where we don't rush the story and we don't simplify the darkness, is what you're here for, then take a second to like the video and subscribe. It helps this channel reach people who want more than surface-level storytelling, and it lets me keep making long-form explorations like this one. Chapter 2, The Council of Elrond, is the chapter where Tolkien slows time itself, because before the world can move forward, it must first remember, confess, argue, and finally accept the truth it has avoided for generations. And Rivendell becomes not merely a refuge, but a courtroom of history, where ancient failures are placed openly on the table, and no one present is innocent of delay, doubt, or denial, and Elrond's council gathers not heroes in the romantic sense, but representatives of fractured peoples, each carrying the weight of their own losses, fears, and unfinished wars. And Tolkien structures this chapter as a deliberate unfolding of memory, because evil in Middle-earth is not sudden. It is cumulative, built layer by layer through hesitation, pride, misunderstanding, and the hope that someone else will deal with it later. And the ring's story is retold not as myth, but as indictment, beginning with Isildur's choice at the fires of Mount Doom, a moment Tolkien reframes here not as simple greed, but as tragic blindness, because Isildur does not believe the ring to be alive, to be willful, to be dangerous beyond comprehension. And this misunderstanding echoes through every age that follows, as the ring slips from hand to hand, never truly lost, only waiting. And when Gandalf recounts his long suspicion and fear, his slow realization of the ring's true nature, Tolkien makes a devastating point. Wisdom often arrives late, not because the wise are foolish, but because truth is patient and deception wears the mask of comfort. And as Boromir speaks of Gondor's suffering, his words burn with urgency and pride, and Tolkien is careful not to portray him as corrupt or villainous here, because temptation is most convincing when it arises from love of one's people. And Boromir's argument, that the ring should be wielded as a weapon, sounds practical, brave, and even noble, and this is precisely why it is so dangerous, because Tolkien exposes the lie at the heart of power. That strength can control what was designed only to corrupt, and the council fractures under this debate, voices rising, ancient grievances surfacing, dwarves mistrusting elves, men resenting abandonment, each race revealing wounds that long predate Sauron yet feed his return. And the ring sits silently at the center of it all, exerting pressure without movement, drawing out pride, fear, and desire like a mirror that shows each soul its weakest point. And Tolkien's genius here lies in refusing easy answers, because no option presented is safe. Hiding the ring will fail, using it will doom them, destroying it seems impossible, and delay is itself a form of surrender. And Frodo's presence throughout this chapter is almost ghost-like, because while the great debate rages, he listens, watches, and feels the weight of history pressed down on him, understanding instinctively that the argument is circling him even before he speaks. And when he finally does, offering to take the ring to Mordor, the moment lands with quiet devastation, because Frodo does not volunteer out of confidence or ambition, but out of recognition, as if he understands that the ring has already chosen him, and this is one of Tolkien's most profound philosophical assertions. That true responsibility is rarely chosen freely, it is accepted when avoidance becomes impossible, and Frodo's words carry no certainty of success, only resolve, and the silence that follows is not relief but grief, because everyone present knows what this means, that an innocent life is being offered to a task that will consume it, and yet no one stops him, because wisdom without courage is useless, and courage without sacrifice is meaningless, and when companions begin to step forward. Sam without question, Aragorn with acceptance rather than desire, Legolas and Gimli bridging ancient hatred through shared purpose. The fellowship forms not as a band of equals, but as a convergence of necessity, and Tolkien deliberately avoids triumph here, because the forging of the fellowship is not celebratory, it is mournful, marked by the understanding that most who begin this road will not return unchanged, and Elrond's final words carry neither hope nor despair, only truth. That the road will be hard, that betrayal and loss are likely, and that success is uncertain, and this chapter closes with destiny no longer abstract, no longer debated, but set in motion, reminding us that the most world-altering decisions are often made not in moments of glory, but in rooms filled with argument, doubt, and reluctant agreement, where people choose the harder path not because it guarantees victory, but because every other path guarantees failure. Chapter 3, The Ring Goes South, is the chapter where resolve is tested by reality, because once the council ends and the fellowship is named, Tolkien immediately strips away the illusion that unity guarantees safety, showing instead that agreement is fragile, temporary, and constantly under pressure from fear, weather, memory, and the ring itself. And as the company prepares to leave Rivendell, the mood is not triumphant but subdued, almost mournful, because everyone understands that departure is a form of loss. A quiet severing from places of rest that may never be seen again, and Tolkien lingers here deliberately, letting us feel the weight of unfinished conversations, unspoken goodbyes, and the awareness that once the road is taken, it will demand more than anyone has yet admitted, and Frodo's inner state mirrors this tension, because though he has accepted the burden publicly, privately he feels increasingly isolated, aware that leadership has fallen on him without granting authority, strength, or certainty. And this chapter deepens the psychological cost of bearing the ring, not through dramatic temptation, but through subtle erosion, as Frodo senses himself becoming the axis around which danger turns, watched not only by enemies, but by fate itself, and Tolkien introduces a crucial theme here. That the ring's power is not only in domination, but in separation, slowly positioning Frodo as different, distant, and inwardly alone even among companions who love him. And as the fellowship sets out southward, their path deliberately uncertain, Tolkien reinforces the idea that wisdom does not guarantee clarity, because even Gandalf cannot choose the safest route, only the least disastrous one, and the debate between Caradhras and Moria becomes symbolic rather than logistical, representing the eternal human dilemma between confronting known darkness or risking the unpredictable cruelty of the natural world. And when the mountain turns against them, snow falling with unnatural malice, Tolkien frames the environment itself as an adversary, ancient and resentful, as if Middle-earth remembers old wounds and resists being used as a mere passageway for destiny, and the fellowship's struggle against the mountain is not heroic, but exhausting, filled with frustration, cold, and creeping doubt, and Boromir's strength shines here not in battle but in labor, pushing through snow, lifting others, embodying the kind of physical heroism that earns loyalty. Yet Tolkien carefully balances this with Boromir's growing fixation on the ring, because proximity intensifies temptation, and strength without humility becomes a liability rather than protection, and Frodo's increasing weariness during this chapter is deeply significant, because nothing dramatic happens to him externally. Yet internally the burden grows heavier, pressing down not only on his body but on his sense of self, as the ring seems to grow more aware, more present, amplifying tension within the group without ever speaking aloud. And when the fellowship is forced to abandon Caradhras, retreating in failure, the moment is devastating precisely because it proves that willpower alone is insufficient, that not every obstacle can be overcome by effort, and that sometimes retreat is the only form of survival available. And this realization feeds the looming dread of Moria, a place of ancient ruin and unresolved tragedy, where darkness is not abstract but historical, carved into stone and memory, and Gandalf's reluctance to enter Moria reveals his own limits, reminding us that even the wise are haunted by places where they once failed or nearly fell. And as the Fellowship stands at the threshold, choosing to descend rather than be destroyed by the mountain. Tolkien frames this choice as the true crossing point of the story, because from here onward, escape becomes increasingly unlikely, and every step forward deepens commitment. And the chapter closes not with action but with foreboding, with silence heavy and expectant, as the Fellowship enters the mines, unaware of exactly what awaits them, but fully aware that the world above is now farther away than ever, making The Ring Goes South a meditation on transition, endurance, and the slow realization that destiny is not a single dramatic moment, but a series of decisions made under pressure, fatigue, and fear, where the greatest danger is not the enemy ahead, but the strain placed upon unity itself, reminding us that the road does not test us by what it throws in our path, but by what it draws out of us as we walk it. Chapter 4, A Journey in the Dark, is the chapter where Tolkien strips away the last comforts of the surface world and forces the Fellowship into a place where light is scarce, memory is oppressive, and every step forward feels like trespass, because Moria is not simply a ruined city, but a graveyard of ambition, a monument to what happens when mastery over stone, craft, and wealth outpaces wisdom and restraint. And as the Fellowship enters the mines, the air itself feels different. Heavy with silence that is not peaceful but watchful, as if the mountain remembers the hands that carved it and resents the living for daring to return. And Tolkien's packing here is deliberate and claustrophobic, because time stretches unnaturally in the dark, days blurring together without sun or stars, eroding morale and heightening paranoia. And this is where the ring's psychological pressure intensifies again, not through overt temptation, but through isolation. Because Frodo becomes increasingly aware that he is the axis around which danger turns, the quiet center of gravity pulling unseen forces closer, and Gandalf's leadership in Moria is marked by humility and uncertainty, a crucial contrast to the mythic wizard archetype, because here he is not omniscient, not all-powerful, but cautious, calculating, and visibly burdened by memory. And when they reach the chamber of Mazarbul, the chapter's emotional core crystallizes around the book they find. A simple record of Balin's doomed colony, its final entries dissolving into panic and despair, and Tolkien's choice to tell this tragedy through fragmented writing rather than exposition is devastating, because it mirrors how history actually survives disaster, not as complete narratives, but as broken sentences, last thoughts, and unanswered cries, and the realization that Balin and his people did not fall heroically, but were slowly overwhelmed, cornered, and erased, transforms Moria from a dangerous passage into a warning, showing the Fellowship not a hypothetical future, but a possible end, and the attack that follows, sudden and brutal, shatters any lingering sense of control, as orcs and the cave troll crash into the chamber like a physical manifestation of the mountain's hatred. And Frodo's wounding here is profoundly symbolic, because although the mithril coat saves his life, the blow reminds us that protection does not negate vulnerability, that survival often depends on unseen grace rather than earned strength. And Boromir's response to Frodo's fall is one of the chapter's most human moments, his raw grief revealing that beneath his pride and ambition lies genuine loyalty, complicating our understanding of his earlier arguments and reminding us that temptation does not erase love, it coexists with it. And as the Fellowship flees through twisting halls and endless stairs, Tolkien turns movement itself into a test of will, because running in darkness is not heroic, it is desperate, disorienting, and exhausting, and the sense that something vast and ancient is awakening behind them grows steadily until it becomes undeniable. And when Gandalf confronts the Balrog on the bridge of Khazad-dûm, the story reaches one of its most mythic and devastating moments, because the Balrog is not merely a monster, but a relic of the same primordial order as Gandalf himself, a being of fire and shadow born before the shaping of the world, and their confrontation is not just physical but symbolic, representing the eternal struggle between light that guides and fire that consumes. And Gandalf's fall is framed not as failure but as choice, a deliberate sacrifice made to protect others, and Tolkien's restraint here is crucial, because he does not linger on spectacle, he lingers on silence, shock, and the raw, unprocessed grief of those left behind, especially Frodo, whose scream of Gandalf's name echoes not just through the halls of Moria, but through the entire moral structure of the story. Marking the first irreplaceable loss of the quest, and as the Fellowship stumbles into daylight, broken and diminished, the contrast between the beauty of the world outside and the devastation within is almost cruel, because survival offers no comfort when it is purchased with loss, and Aragorn's quiet assumption of leadership at the chapter's end is one of Tolkien's most understated yet powerful transitions, because leadership here is not claimed, but inherited through necessity, grief, and resolve. And A Journey in the Dark becomes a meditation on descent, not only into physical darkness, but into the reality that every great endeavor demands payment, often in forms we cannot anticipate or prepare for, reminding us that the road to saving the world does not begin with glory, but with the willingness to walk forward even after something essential has fallen away forever. Chapter 5: The Bridge of Khazad-dûm, when extended beyond its immediate events, reveals itself as the moral fracture line of the entire Fellowship, the moment where the quest stops being theoretical and becomes irrevocably costly, because Gandalf's fall is not simply the loss of a powerful guide, but the collapse of the unspoken assumption that wisdom will always arrive in time to prevent catastrophe, and Tolkien deliberately places this loss at a point where the Fellowship has not yet truly failed, which makes the sacrifice more unsettling. Because it tells us that even when courage is sufficient and unity holds, the road may still demand something irreplaceable, and the bridge itself becomes a symbol far larger than the span of stone it represents, standing as a threshold between an older world of mythic guardianship and a harsher reality where each character must now confront the limits of their own strength. And the stillness that follows Gandalf's fall is one of the most important silences in Tolkien's work. Because it is not filled with reassurance, prophecy, or immediate resolve, but with shock, disbelief, and the raw human inability to process loss while still being forced to survive, and Aragorn's command to move forward, often read as simple leadership, becomes something more brutal upon closer examination, because it is an act of emotional violence committed for the sake of preservation, forcing grief to wait because there is no space for collapse. Boromir's visible anguish here reshapes his arc, revealing that his later failure is not born from cruelty or selfishness, but from a desperate desire to replace what has been lost, to become the strength that Gandalf no longer provides, a desire that will ultimately overwhelm him, and Frodo's reaction deserves particular attention, because Gandalf's fall removes the one figure who consistently mediated the ring's burden for him, translating terror into language, danger into strategy, and responsibility into something survivable, and without Gandalf, Frodo is not only more vulnerable to enemies, but more exposed to the ring's psychological pressure, as there is now no one left who both understands the ring fully and stands outside its influence. And Tolkien emphasizes this absence subtly, not by immediately intensifying temptation, but by increasing isolation, because Frodo begins to sense that the burden is now truly his. Shared in companionship, but carried alone in consequence, and the Fellowship's emergence into Dimril Dale beneath open sky does not function as relief, but as dissonance, because beauty no longer feels earned, and the natural world's indifference becomes emotionally jarring, reinforcing the idea that loss does not pause the world, it only changes how the world is perceived. And the Mirrormere scene, often overlooked, extends the chapter's thematic depth even further. Because reflection here becomes confrontation, not nostalgia, forcing each character to look into waters that remember an older Middle-earth untouched by decay, and in doing so, Tolkien confronts the reader with a painful truth. That memory itself can wound, because to remember what was is to feel more sharply what has been lost, and Aragorn's quiet reverence at the water's edge signals a subtle transformation, as he begins to embody leadership shaped not by destiny alone, but by grief endured and accepted, and the chapter's extended significance lies in how it reframes heroism entirely, because Gandalf's sacrifice is not presented as triumphant martyrdom, but as a necessary subtraction. A reminder that saving the world does not always add strength, it often removes it, leaving those who remain weaker, frightened, and yet still responsible. And in this way, the Bridge of Khazad-dûm becomes a meditation on irreversible moments, the kind that divide life into before and after, reminding us that some thresholds cannot be crossed without loss, and that maturity, whether of individuals, fellowships, or civilizations, is born not from victory, but from learning how to carry absence without allowing it to hollow purpose itself. When continued in its full psychological and philosophical weight, becomes the moment where the fellowship begins to fracture internally even as it remains outwardly united, because Gandalf's loss introduces a permanent imbalance that no amount of courage or companionship can fully repair, and Tolkien is deeply intentional in showing the grief is not evenly distributed, not shared cleanly, but experienced in isolation even among friends. And this is why the fellowship's silence after the bridge feels so oppressive, because it is not collective mourning but parallel suffering, each member retreating inward to process the same absence in different ways. And Aragorn's burden intensifies here beyond leadership into something closer to guardianship of morale, as he must now hold together not just a mission, but a fragile emotional structure that could collapse if left unattended. And Tolkien quietly shows us that Aragorn's destiny as king is not forged in triumph or command, but in restraint, in choosing not to speak when words would ring hollow, in choosing motion over paralysis even when motion feels cruel, and Boromir's internal shift deepens further in this extended aftermath, because Gandalf's fall awakens in him both reverence and resentment, reverence for the sacrifice made, and resentment toward a world that would allow such power to be lost, while asking mortal men to continue the struggle. And this resentment does not yet turn outward, but it begins to ferment, mixing with fear and pride into a volatile mixture that Tolkien allows to simmer quietly, making later events feel tragically inevitable rather than sudden. And Frodo's inner world becomes markedly lonelier here, because Gandalf's absence removes not only guidance but narrative reassurance, the sense that someone else understands the larger pattern. And Tolkien subtly increases Frodo's isolation by emphasizing how others now look to him differently, with concern, protectiveness, and sometimes fear, reinforcing the uncomfortable truth that being the ring-bearer places him slightly apart from those who walk beside him. And this separation is not imposed by the ring alone, but by the nature of responsibility itself, because some burdens cannot be fully shared no matter how willing the companions, and the fellowship's passage away from Moria becomes almost ritualistic in its quietness, as if noise itself would dishonor the sacrifice just made. And Tolkien uses the landscape here not as backdrop, but as emotional amplifier, with the open sky feeling vast rather than freeing, emphasizing how small the company now feels without its greatest pillar, and the still waters of the Mirrormere gain even greater symbolic depth in this continuation, because reflection becomes an act of reckoning, forcing each character to confront the contrast between permanence and transience, between the ancient endurance of stone and the fragile span of individual lives. And Aragorn's gaze into the water can be read as the first moment he truly accepts that leadership will require him to become something Gandalf once was for others, even knowing that he cannot replace him. And this acceptance is quiet, uncelebrated, and heavy, which is precisely Tolkien's point, because real leadership is not assumed in moments of power, but inherited in moments of loss. And the extended meaning of this chapter ultimately rests in how it reshapes the fellowship's relationship to the quest itself, because after the bridge, success is no longer imagined as a return to peace, but merely as the prevention of greater ruin, a lowering of expectations that makes endurance possible but joy rarer. And Tolkien is unflinching in this portrayal, reminding us that some sacrifices permanently alter the emotional landscape of those who survive, narrowing the range of possible futures. And in this way, the Bridge of Khazad-dûm stands as the moral spine of the journey, the chapter that teaches the fellowship and the reader that the road will not always reward bravery with hope, that sometimes it answers courage with absence, and that continuing anyway is not optimism, but resolve born from the refusal to let loss be meaningless. Chapter 6, Lothlorien, is the chapter where Tolkien introduces a paradox at the heart of his world, because after loss, darkness, and death, the fellowship does not emerge into relief, but into something far more unsettling. Untouched beauty that exists outside the normal flow of time, and Lothlorien is not simply a forest, but a living memory of what Middle-earth once was and may never be again, a place where decay has been held at bay not through strength, but through preservation. And from the moment the fellowship crosses its borders, the tone shifts radically, because fear recedes without vanishing, grief softens without healing, and time itself becomes elastic, stretching and slowing until the past feels closer than the present, and Tolkien uses this environment to challenge both characters and readers, because Lothlorien offers what every weary soul desires: safety, clarity, and peace, yet demands something equally heavy in return. The willingness to confront what you are without the noise of survival to distract you, and Aragorn's reaction to the Golden Wood reveals his divided nature more clearly than any speech could, because here he is both heir and exile, beloved of the elves yet bound to the fate of men, standing in a place where immortality lingers like perfume, knowing he cannot remain, and Boromir's discomfort is equally telling, because Lothlorien offers no obvious enemy, no battlefield, no task that can be met with strength alone, and this quiet exposes his inner conflict more sharply than Moria ever did, while Frodo's experience of the forest is deeply internal, almost dreamlike, as if the ring's burden grows both lighter and heavier at once, because in a place of preserved goodness, corruption becomes more visible rather than less, and Tolkien carefully builds toward the meeting with Galadriel not as a climax of authority, but as a confrontation with possibility. Because Galadriel is not merely a ruler, she is a mirror, and when she tests the Fellowship, she does not accuse or command, she simply allows each member to glimpse who they could become if they surrendered to their deepest desire or fear, and this is where Tolkien delivers one of his most profound philosophical moments, because Galadriel's refusal of the ring is not framed as moral superiority, but as hardened wisdom. An understanding that even the desire to do good can become tyranny when amplified by absolute power, and her words resonate beyond Middle-earth, speaking directly to the human tendency to justify domination in the language of protection and order. And Frodo's offering of the ring to Galadriel is not naive but desperate, a moment where exhaustion briefly outweighs resolve. And Galadriel's rejection does not remove Frodo's burden, it returns it to him with greater clarity, reinforcing the cruel truth that responsibility cannot be transferred simply because it hurts. And as the Fellowship rests in Lothlorien, days passing unnoticed, Tolkien emphasizes how rest itself becomes dangerous, because attachment to peace can weaken the will to continue, and the gifts the company receives are not comforts, but tools shaped for trials ahead, reminders that even kindness in Middle-earth is purposeful, forward-looking, and tinged with farewell. And when the Fellowship finally departs, leaving behind the Golden Wood, the moment feels heavier than leaving danger, because what they abandon here is not safety but possibility, the possibility of stopping, of remaining, of being preserved rather than tested. And Lothlorien becomes a meditation on grace without escape, beauty without possession, and healing that does not absolve responsibility, reminding us that the most meaningful sanctuaries do not exist to keep us forever, but to prepare us to return to the road stronger, clearer, and more aware of what we are fighting to protect. Chapter 7, The Mirror of Galadriel, is the chapter where Tolkien confronts one of the most uncomfortable truths in all of his legendarium: that seeing the future does not grant power over it, but rather strips away the comfort of ignorance, and in doing so, he transforms Lothlorien from a sanctuary into a place of moral testing, because the mirror is not a weapon, not a prophecy, and not a guide, but a revelation device that offers fragments of possibility without explanation, forcing those who look into it to wrestle not with fate itself, but with their own response to uncertainty. And Tolkien is careful to emphasize that Galadriel does not command Frodo to look, nor does she forbid it, because true temptation never arrives as coercion, it arrives as invitation, and when Frodo gazes into the mirror, what he sees is not a single future, but a collage of potential catastrophes, Shire under threat, familiar places darkened, loved ones endangered, and Tolkien's choice here is crucial, because he does not show Frodo personal glory or victory, but loss, distortion, and vulnerability, reminding us that the ring-bearer's greatest fear is not his own suffering, but the harm that may come to others because of him, and this vision destabilizes Frodo in a way no Nazgul ever could, because it introduces the crushing awareness that even success may come too late, and that good intentions do not guarantee protection. And Sam's experience of the mirror reinforces this theme even further, because Sam sees both ruin and restoration, devastation followed by renewal, and yet Tolkien denies him certainty by refusing to show the order in which these things occur, leaving Sam to grapple with the idea that hope and despair may coexist rather than cancel one another out. And this ambiguity is the mirror's true danger, because it does not lie, but it does not explain, and humans are not built to endure knowledge without context. And Galadriel herself embodies this paradox more fully than anyone else in Middle-earth. Because she is ancient, wise, powerful, and yet profoundly constrained, not by lack of strength, but by restraint, having long ago learned that foresight without humility becomes tyranny, and when Frodo offers her the ring, the moment becomes one of the most psychologically and philosophically significant scenes in the entire story. Because Tolkien allows us to witness temptation in its most seductive form, not as cruelty or domination, but as benevolent order, as Galadriel imagines herself as a queen beautiful and terrible, wielding power not to destroy the world, but to save it according to her own vision. And this is Tolkien's sharpest warning, because the desire to do good is often the most dangerous justification for absolute power. And Galadriel's refusal is not framed as moral perfection, but as hardened renunciation, a victory achieved through centuries of self-denial and painful self-knowledge. And her statement that she will diminish and go into the West is not resignation, but release, an acceptance that preserving beauty forever requires the sacrifice of dominion. And for Frodo, this moment crystallizes a devastating truth. That even the wisest cannot carry the ring without being consumed, and therefore neither can he hope to master it, only to endure it for as long as possible. And Tolkien deepens this realization by having Galadriel acknowledge Frodo's burden explicitly, validating his fear rather than minimizing it. And this validation is quietly transformative because it does not remove the weight, but it confirms that the weight is real, deserved, and recognized. And the chapter's emotional gravity extends further in how it reframes the Fellowship's journey after Gandalf's fall, because where Moria taught them about loss, the mirror teaches them about inevitability, showing that suffering cannot be avoided through foresight, only faced with integrity. And Tolkien's refusal to clarify which visions will come to pass reinforces his belief that moral action must be grounded not in predicted outcomes, but in present responsibility. And as the Fellowship prepares to leave Lothlorien, the gifts they receive take on added significance in light of the mirror's lesson, because they are not tools to control the future, but aids for navigating uncertainty, light for darkness, rope for descent, cloaks for concealment, symbolizing adaptability rather than dominance. And Galadriel's farewell is tinged with both hope and sorrow, because she knows more than she says, and yet chooses silence over interference. Trusting the small and the fragile to do what the mighty cannot, and the mirror of Galadriel ultimately stands as Tolkien's meditation on vision, responsibility, and restraint, reminding us that knowing what may come does not absolve us from choosing how to act now, and that wisdom lies not in foreseeing every consequence, but in refusing to let fear of the future corrupt the moral clarity of the present. Chapter 8, Farewell to Lorien, unfolds like a long exhale after grief and revelation, yet Tolkien ensures that this breath is uneasy, because leaving Lothlorien is not simply departure from safety, but separation from a way of being that cannot survive in the wider world. And the Fellowship's farewell is heavy precisely because it is voluntary, chosen not because danger has arrived, but because stagnation would be its own form of failure. And Tolkien frames this departure as a kind of moral necessity, reminding us that sanctuary is meant to restore the weary, not replace the road. And as the Fellowship steps into their boats upon the Silverlode and then the Great Anduin, the river becomes more than geography, it becomes momentum itself, a force that does not argue or persuade but simply carries, embodying time, consequence, and the irreversible nature of choice. And Frodo's silence during these moments deepens, because Lorien has given him not comfort but clarity, stripping away illusions while offering no escape. And now he bears that clarity alone, watching the golden woods recede behind him like a memory already slipping into legend. And Sam's grief is quieter but profound, because for him, Lorien represented not only beauty, but the promise that goodness still exists untouched by shadow, and leaving it feels like leaving proof behind. And yet Tolkien insists that this pain is necessary, because clinging to beauty would mean refusing responsibility, and Aragorn's presence during this chapter is subtly transformed by Galadriel's gift, not because it grants power, but because it confirms identity, anchoring him in a lineage he must eventually embrace. And yet even now he delays that destiny, choosing companionship over kingship, shared hardship over isolated authority, and Boromir's internal tension becomes more visible along the river. As the constant proximity to the ring without the guidance of Gandalf or the sanctity of Lorien allows his thoughts to wander into dangerous territory, and Tolkien's genius here lies in how he does not villainize Boromir outright, but frames his struggle as tragically human, a man from a world already burning, watching salvation drift past him in the hands of someone small, quiet, and seemingly unfit for the task. And this perception does not come from malice, but from fear sharpened by love for his people, making the unity of the Fellowship increasingly fragile not because of external pressure, but because of internal divergence, as each member begins to imagine the future differently, and the river journey itself reinforces this fragmentation, because unlike walking, where pace can be shared and conversation flows naturally, boats isolate, placing each traveler slightly apart, surrounded by water and thought. And Tolkien uses this physical separation to mirror emotional distance, allowing unspoken doubts to grow unchecked, and Legola's and Gimli's growing friendship offers a counterpoint to this tension, suggesting that unity is still possible, but must now be actively chosen rather than assumed. And when the Fellowship passes the Argonath, the Pillars of the Kings, the moment carries immense symbolic weight, because these towering figures of ancient authority stand as silent witnesses to the journey, neither gidding nor obstructing, representing a past age of strength that could not ultimately prevent decline. And Aragorn's response to the statues is deeply internalized, because he sees not glory but responsibility, not inheritance but expectation, and the silence of the kings echoes Gandalf's absence, reinforcing the theme that guidance must now come from within rather than above. And Frodo's reaction to the Argonath is equally telling, because he feels their gaze not as judgment but as reminder that history watches even the smallest figures, and that significance is not reserved for the mighty. And as the Fellowship drifts southward, Tolkien slows time deliberately, allowing tension to thicken without resolution, making the chapter feel suspended between peace and catastrophe, because danger has not yet arrived, but inevitability has, and every mile downstream narrows the range of possible choices. And the chapter's emotional core lies in this quiet narrowing, this sense that the Fellowship is still whole in body but beginning to divide in will, and Tolkien refuses to dramatize this openly, choosing instead to let glances linger, silences stretch, and thoughts remain unspoken, because true fractures often form not in moments of conflict, but in prolonged uncertainty, and Farewell to Lorien ultimately becomes a meditation on transition, on the cost of leaving behind what sustains us in order to protect what depends on us, reminding us that beauty can inspire, but it cannot substitute for action, and that even the most luminous havens must eventually be surrendered if the world beyond them is to survive. Chapter 9, The Great River, unfolds as a slow constriction of possibility, a chapter not driven by action but by pressure, where Tolkien transforms the Anduin from a path of movement into a corridor of decision, because rivers do not allow wandering, they carry you where they flow, and the Fellowship now finds itself borne forward by forces larger than preference or debate. And this is precisely why tension begins to surface here, not because anyone openly argues, but because each member begins to understand that neutrality is no longer an option. And Frodo, more than anyone, feels this tightening, because the ring grows heavier not in weight, but in implication, demanding not just endurance but direction. And Tolkien is subtle in showing how Frodo's silence shifts from contemplative to isolating, as he begins to withdraw not out of fear, but out of responsibility, recognizing that the more others influence his decision, the more dangerous that influence becomes. And Aragorn's role during this chapter is one of quiet containment, attempting to hold the Fellowship together while knowing, perhaps better than any of them, that it cannot remain whole much longer, because leadership here means shepherding others toward a moment of fracture while delaying it just enough to prevent disaster. And Boromir's struggle intensifies dramatically along the Great River, because every league south feels like a betrayal of his homeland. Every day spent drifting toward Mordor rather than Minas Tirith feels like a failure of duty, and Tolkien's portrayal of Boromir here is deeply tragic rather than villainous, because his desire to use the ring is not rooted in domination, but in urgency, in the terror of watching his world burn while salvation floats within arm's reach, carried by someone who seems unwilling to grasp it, and this perception eats away at him, turning admiration into frustration, frustration into obsession, and obsession into justification. And the river journey exacerbates this internal decay because there is no distraction, no labor, no battle to burn off excess thought, only the endless sound of water and the looming presence of the eastern shore, where shadow thickens with every bend, and Tolkien amplifies this sense of unease through geography itself, as the Fellowship skirts the Emin Muil, those jagged hills that seem to watch them in silence. While the East Bank grows darker, more hostile, less forgiving, reinforcing the feeling that the world itself is leaning toward conflict, and Legolas and Gimli continue to provide contrast, their growing bond a reminder that unity is still possible, but theirs is a unity forged through shared effort and mutual curiosity, not burden or destiny, and it cannot extend to the ring itself, which remains a singular, isolating force. And the pivotal moment of the chapter arrives not with violence, but with deliberation, as Aragorn finally raises the question that has haunted them since Lórien. Where do they go from here? And Tolkien frames this council not as democratic debate, but as moral crossroads, because every path forward carries loss, and Frodo's internal conflict becomes almost unbearable here, torn between loyalty to the Fellowship, fear of endangering others, and the growing realization that the ring's influence is magnified by proximity, making companionship itself a risk. And when Frodo slips away to think alone, Tolkien signals a crucial transformation. Because this is the first time Frodo actively chooses separation, not as a consequence of fear, but as an act of protection, and Boromir's confrontation with Frodo is the inevitable eruption of everything the river has been compressing, a moment fueled not by sudden madness, but by long-suppressed desperation. And Tolkien's brilliance lies in how he allows Boromir's plea to feel almost reasonable at first, grounded in logic, patriotism, and urgency, before it crosses the line into coercion, revealing how easily noble intentions can be weaponized when filtered through fear. And Frodo's escape, aided by the ring, marks a devastating shift, because for the first time the ring functions not merely as a burden, but as a tool of separation, enabling Frodo to vanish not just physically, but relationally, severing trust and proximity in a way that cannot be undone. And the Fellowship's realization that Frodo has gone is immediate and catastrophic. Because Aragorn understands at once what this means, that the quest has passed a point of no return, that unity is no longer the goal but survival of purpose, and his choice to send Sam after Frodo rather than chase him himself is perhaps his greatest act of leadership so far, because it acknowledges Frodo's autonomy while ensuring he is not utterly alone. And the chapter closes with the Fellowship irrevocably altered, Boromir broken by remorse, Aragorn burdened by division, and Frodo and Sam stepping into a future defined not by strength of arms or wisdom of counsels, but by endurance, loyalty, and the quiet terror of being small in a world that no longer offers shelter, making The Great River the chapter where Tolkien fully dismantles the illusion of collective heroism, replacing it with parallel paths, fractured destinies, and the sobering truth that even the strongest bonds must sometimes be broken for the greater good. Chapter 10, The Breaking of the Fellowship, is the moment where Tolkien allows consequence to finally arrive in full, not as spectacle but as devastation, because the true breaking of the Fellowship does not begin with Boromir's fall or Frodo's flight, but with the realization that there is no version of the future in which everyone survives unchanged. And the chapter opens in a state of emotional freefall as Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli search desperately for Frodo, knowing already that the search itself may be futile. Because the ring does not want to be found, and Tolkien's cruelty here is precise, forcing the characters to feel the cost of hesitation, because if they had spoken sooner, decided sooner, trusted sooner, perhaps this fracture could have been delayed, though never avoided. And Aragorn's anguish in this chapter is quiet but absolute, because leadership now demands not guidance but judgment under pressure, and the pressure is merciless, allowing no correct answer, only necessary ones. And Boromir's death arrives not as punishment, but as reckoning, because Tolkien refuses to reduce him to a cautionary tale about temptation, instead granting him a warrior's end that restores dignity without erasing guilt. And Boromir's final confession to Aragorn is one of the most human moments in the entire legendarium, because it acknowledges failure without excuse, love without condition, and loyalty that arrives too late to save the fellowship, but not too late to save Boromir himself. And Aragorn's response is not condemnation, but recognition, calling Boromir my brother, affirming that redemption does not undo harm, but can still reclaim meaning. And the violence that surrounds Boromir's death is swift and brutal, not heroic in tone, but chaotic and tragic, reinforcing Tolkien's belief that war does not elevate, it consumes. And the scattering of Merry and Pippin becomes the final shattering blow, because now the fellowship is not merely divided by choice, but torn apart by force, and Aragorn's internal conflict reaches its breaking point here, because he must decide whether to pursue Frodo and Sam toward Mordor, follow the captors of Merry and Pippin into open war, or attempt the impossible task of doing both. And Tolkien frames this decision not as strategy, but as identity. Because Aragorn's choice reveals who he is becoming, not who he hopes to be, and when he chooses to follow Merry and Pippin, he does so not because Frodo matters less, but because Frodo has already chosen his path, and leadership now demands honoring that choice rather than undermining it. And this moment marks Aragorn's full assumption of responsibility, because he accepts that he cannot protect everyone, only act with integrity amid loss. And Frodo and Sam's departure into the wilderness is deliberately understated, stripped of drama, because Tolkien understands that the most important journeys often begin in silence, with fear held close and resolve untested, and Frodo's insistence on going alone reveals how deeply the ring has taught him isolation. Yet Sam's refusal to be left behind reasserts the story's core truth, that loyalty freely chosen can resist even the most corrosive influence. And Sam's near drowning to reach Frodo is not merely physical peril, but symbolic defiance, a declaration that companionship is not granted by destiny, but claimed through action. And the chapter's final images are intentionally unresolved, with Boromir laid to rest upon the river, drifting toward lands he will never save, Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli running north into uncertainty, and Frodo and Sam turning east toward a darkness that has no promise of victory. And Tolkien ends the fellowship not with closure, but with dispersion, because this story is not about a group completing a quest together, but about individuals carrying fragments of a shared purpose into separate trials, and the breaking of the fellowship stands as Tolkien's most honest admission that even the strongest bonds cannot always survive the weight of the world, that sacrifice often demands separation, and that the cost of choosing the right path is sometimes losing the people who helped you reach it, leaving us with a truth that defines the rest of the journey, that hope does not require unity, only persistence, and that even when the fellowship is broken, its meaning endures in every step taken by those who remain faithful to what was shared. Book 2 ends without resolution, without victory, without unity, and that's the point. Tolkien doesn't reward courage with comfort here, he rewards it with responsibility. By the time the fellowship breaks, there are no clean paths left, only necessary ones. Frodo walks into darkness not because he is fearless, but because someone must. Aragorn runs toward war not because he wants a crown, but because leadership no longer allows hesitation. And what Book 2 ultimately leaves us with is a hard truth, that sometimes the world is not saved by strength or wisdom, or unity, but by endurance, loyalty, and the willingness to keep walking after everything familiar has fallen away. This has been Book 2 of The Lord of the Rings, not as a story of travel, but as a study of pressure, fracture, and moral weight. And this is Whispers of Wisdom, where we don't just read great books, we listen to what they're trying to tell us. I'll see you in the next chapter.